What you're about to read is not fiction. Every name, every date, every document cited here exists in archives, newspapers, court records, or declassified files. Some parts will feel impossible. They happened anyway. On the night of November 12, 1954, a 32-year-old insurance salesman named James Grover Jimmy Glover stepped off the last train from Richmond into the little town of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, carrying nothing but a cheap suitcase and a secret that would change the course of the Cold War. Jimmy was nobody special. He had a receding hairline, a slight limp from a high school football injury, and a habit of humming Tennessee Waltz when he was nervous. He sold policies for Mutual of Omaha door to door across Virginia and the Carolinas, smiling too wide, remembering birthdays, always closing. That was the public Jimmy. The private one had been recruited 3 years earlier in a motel off Route 1 by a man who never gave his real name, only Mr. Bishop. Bishop worked for something that didn't officially exist yet, a joint Navy-CIA project codenamed Aquatone, the program that would birth the U-2 spy plane. They needed civilians who could travel the South without drawing attention, men whose day jobs gave them perfect cover to photograph restricted military sites, map radar stations, and quietly buy drinks for lonely Air Force sergeants. Jimmy Glover was perfect. He never asked why they picked him. He told himself it was patriotism. He told himself the extra cash paid the mortgage. He never told his wife Dorothy where the money really came from. By 1954, the U-2 was flying, and the game had changed. The Soviets knew they were being watched from 90,000 feet. They started hunting the hunters. One of the ways they hunted was by planting stories, absurd, lurid stories about flying saucers and little green men. The crazier the story, the more the American press chased it. The more the real spy flights disappeared under a fog of tinfoil hats and supermarket tabloids. It was called noise cover, and it worked like a charm. Jimmy's last assignment was simple on paper. Go to Kecksburg, a dying coal town an hour southeast of Pittsburgh, and stage the most convincing UFO crash in American history. The object itself had been built in a Lockheed Skunk Works hangar outside Burbank. An 8-foot-long titanium acrylic bale weighted and ballasted to fall exactly like the Soviet rumors described, covered in strange hieroglyphic markings copied from a children's book on ancient Egypt. Inside was a dummy made of ballistics gel and pig bones dressed in a silver suit, its face a nightmare cross between a praying mantis and a human child. The Air Force called the dummy Archie. Jimmy just called it the passenger. On the evening of November 12, an Air Force KB-50 tanker out of Lockburn AFB in Ohio climbed to 40,000 feet and released the bale over western Pennsylvania. It failed trailing green fire, magnesium flares timed to burn out at 3,000 feet. At least 300 people saw it. Farmers, steel workers, a whole high school football team on a bus. Some swore it changed direction. Some swore it screamed. It hit the frozen ground in a ravine outside Kecksburg at 4:47 p.m., exactly on target. Jimmy was already there, checked into the Pineview Motel under the name J. Gordon Vaith, a real Office of Naval Research scientist whose name the CIA loved to borrow. He spent the next 6 hours doing what he did best, talking. He bought beers at the Kecksburg Fire Hall, told wide-eyed volunteer firemen that he was a special investigator from Wright-Patterson, flashed a forged credential wallet, and begged them not to touch the object until the Army arrived. The more he insisted they stayed back, the more they wanted to see it. By midnight, half the town was in the woods with flashlights. At 2:14 a.m., a convoy of olive-drab trucks rolled in. No markings, just black plates. Men in plain clothes with Cincinnati accents ordered the firemen away at gunpoint. A flatbed loaded the bale under canvas. Jimmy watched from the tree line, chain-smoking Lucky Strikes, humming Tennessee Waltz until his throat was raw. Then something happened that was never in the script. One of the soldiers, a baby-faced private from Fort Belleville who wasn't supposed to speak at all, looked straight at Jimmy and said, "Hey, aren't you Dorothy Glover's husband? She goes to my aunt's church in Roanoke." The world tilted. Jimmy felt the November air freeze in his lungs. The private was shipped out to Alaska 2 days later. Jimmy was on a train south by dawn. He thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Because something came down with the bell that night that nobody planned. Something that left footprints in the frozen mud, 3-toed, 9 inches long, too deep for the weight they should have carried. Something that bent saplings without breaking them, and left patches of ground where the grass died in perfect circles that stayed dead for 30 years. Something that made dogs refuse to cross the ravine, and made children wake up screaming about the man with the pumpkin head. The Army sealed the site. NASA sent a team, officially to look for fragments of the Soviet Cosmos 96 probe that had conveniently re-entered that same day. They found nothing, or so they said. Jimmy went back to selling insurance. He drank more. Dorothy noticed the nightmares. In 1959, he put a .38 in his mouth in the garage and only lived because the bullet glanced off the roof of his mouth and came out his cheek. The official story was hunting accident. He spent 6 months in a VA hospital in Salem, Virginia, learning to eat soup through a straw. That's where Mr. Bishop visited him one last time. Bishop slid a photograph across the metal tray table. It showed the Kecksburg object, cracked open like a bronze walnut, being loaded onto an Air Force C-130. In the foreground stood Jimmy himself, 5 years younger, staring straight at the camera. "Congratulations," Bishop said. "You created the perfect distraction." The Soviets spent 2 years chasing their own tails trying to figure out what crashed in Pennsylvania. We overflew their most secret bases 112 times because of you. Jimmy tried to speak. It came out a wet hiss. Bishop leaned closer. "There's just one loose end. The thing you brought down, it wasn't empty. We found remains. Not ours, not theirs. Something else. And it had your fingerprints on it, Jimmy, literally, on the inside of the hatch." Jimmy closed his eyes. He saw the ravine again, the green fire dying in the sky, the bell lying cracked and steaming, and something, tall, thin, moving wrong, crawling out of the wreckage while he stood frozen, humming that goddamn song. Bishop stood up. "Don't worry, we took care of it. The story dies with you." But stories don't die. They mutate. In 1965, a Pittsburgh radio reporter named John Murphy started digging. He found firemen who remembered the Army threatening their families. He found children who still wouldn't walk past the ravine. He found a nurse at Excella Frick Hospital who treated a soldier for radiation burns that night. Burns in the perfect shape of a hand with 3 fingers. Murphy was about to go on air live with the whole story when men in dark suits arrived at the station. The broadcast cut to music. Murphy was found dead in a car wreck 3 months later. No one was ever charged. The Kecksburg incident became the Pennsylvania Roswell, a cult mystery for late-night radio and grainy cable specials. Most people laughed it off. A few never stopped looking. In 1990, a dying man in a hospice outside Roanoke asked a Catholic priest to hear his confession. The priest's name was Father D'Angelo Hanlon. The man's name was James Grover Glover. He told the priest everything. About the bell, about the passenger that wasn't a passenger, about the night he sold his soul for hazard pay in a handshake in a motel parking lot. When he finished, Father O'Hanlon asked the only question that mattered. "Did you open the hatch, son?" Jimmy started to cry blood-tinged tears from the scar tissue where his cheek had been rebuilt. I don't remember," he whispered, "but something opened me." He died an hour later. Father O'Hanlon wrote it all down, 23 handwritten pages, and sealed them in an envelope marked not to be opened until 2035. The envelope went into the diocesan archive in Richmond. In 2017, a janitor found it while cleaning out a flooded basement. He sold it to a collector for $200 and a case of Youngling. The pages leaked online 3 weeks later. That's when the phone started ringing at a little museum in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. A tiny place built inside an old church, funded by donations and run by volunteers who never gave up. They had a scale model of the acorn in a glass case. They had eyewitness statements laminated on the walls. They had soil samples that still set off Geiger counters on cold mornings. And now they had Jimmy Glover's confession. In November 2024, 70 years almost to the day after the fire in the sky, the museum held a ceremony. They unveiled a bronze plaque with a single line, "For James Grover Glover, who carried the truth alone." 2,000 people showed up. Network cameras, drone footage, a senator who wanted votes in the Rust Belt, a retired Air Force general who stood silent at the back with tears on his cheeks. At 4:47 p.m. exactly, the church bell rang once. Every dog in town started howling. And high overhead, too fast to be a plane and too slow to be a meteor, something crossed the sky, trailing green fire that burned out before it touched the trees. Nobody got a clear picture. Phones glitched. Cameras froze. But an 11-year-old girl named Lily Morales stood in the churchyard with her grandfather's old Zenith transistor radio pressed to her ear, and she heard a sound she would never forget. A man's voice, faint and crackling through layers of static, humming Tennessee Waltz like he was trying to remember the words to a prayer. She looked up. For just a second the clouds parted, and she saw it. A bronze acorn the size of a city bus, falling slow, falling gentle, coming home. Then it was gone. The museum still has the plaque. The soil samples still click. And every November, when the air turns cold enough to burn, the people of Kecksburg leave their porch lights on a little longer. They know some stories aren't meant to stay buried. Some stories fall out of the sky screaming, wrap themselves around your life like barbed wire, and wait 70 years for someone brave enough or broken enough to tell the truth.